The moment Jasper Hartwell rode back into Redemption Creek after 4 years of absence, the first thing he saw through the golden haze of the late afternoon sun was Louisa Townsend standing at the front gate of her family's property, one hand resting on the worn wooden post, her dark hair catching the wind, looking for all the world as though she had simply stepped outside to wait for him. He pulled his horse to a stop so abruptly that the animal snorted and stamped, confused by the sudden command after so many miles of steady riding. Jasper sat there in the saddle, covered in trail dust and the particular kind of weariness that comes not from physical exhaustion alone, but from carrying a decision across 1,000 miles of open country, and he stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them moved for a long moment, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the dry grass along the road and the distant clamor of the town behind him. Then Louisa's chin lifted just slightly, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not relief exactly, but a quiet, steady recognition, the way a person looks when something they have believed in for a very long time is finally, undeniably proven true. It was the summer of 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek, Texas, sat at the edge of the hill country like a thing that had been dropped there by accident and decided to stay. It had grown considerably since the cattle drives had begun pushing through the region in the years following the war, and with that growth had come all the complications of a place trying to figure out what it wanted to be: saloons and churches built almost side by side, lawmen who were sometimes barely better than the men they chased, ranchers whose ambitions spread as wide as the land itself, and ordinary families trying to hold their lives together in a place where the ground could be generous one season and cruel the next. Jasper Hartwell had grown up on the western edge of that town, the third son of a man who raised cattle and kept his opinions close to his chest. He had learned to ride before he could properly write his name, and he had spent his boyhood running wild across the sun-baked hills with the kind of freedom that poor boys in rich country sometimes have simply because no one is watching them closely enough. He was not remarkable to look at, tall, lean, with a jaw that had been called stubborn by people who knew him and determined by people who liked him. But there was something in the way he moved through the world, deliberate and quiet, that had always drawn people's attention. He had known Louisa Townsend since they were children, in the way that everyone in a small town knows everyone else, but he had not truly noticed her until the spring he turned 19 and she turned 18, when he had come to help her father mend fencing after a bad storm and had found her out in the field already working, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands sure and steady on the wire. He had stood there watching her for a moment longer than was strictly polite, and she had looked up and caught him at it, and instead of being embarrassed she had simply said, "Are you going to help or are you going to stare?" And he had laughed, genuinely laughed, which was something he did not do easily, and from that afternoon on they had been something to each other that neither of them had quite known how to name. Louisa was 21 when Jasper left. She had dark brown hair that she wore pinned up during the day, and that fell past her shoulders when she let it down in the evenings, and she had her mother's high cheekbones and her father's stubbornness, which in a woman in 1878 was considered either admirable or troublesome, depending on who you asked. She kept the books for her father's small general store, she baked on Sunday mornings, and she had a mind so sharp and precise that the men who underestimated her did so only once. She had been courted by 2 other men in the years since Jasper left, a banker's son from Millbrook who had driven all the way out to see her, and the new deputy, Cal Ferris, who was handsome and well-intentioned and deeply boring, and she had been polite to both of them and sent both of them away. Her mother had said it was because she was too particular. Her best friend, a woman named Della Price who ran the millinery shop on Main Street, had said it was because she was still waiting. Louisa herself had said nothing on the subject to either of them, which was as close to an admission as she was ever going to make. The trouble had started 4 years ago, in the summer of 1874, and it had started the way most trouble starts, with money, with pride, and with a misunderstanding that grew into something much larger than it needed to be. Jasper's father, Edmund Hartwell, had borrowed money from Clifton Beaumont, a rancher who owned the largest spread in the county, and who had a habit of making loans to struggling families in the certain knowledge that he would collect something worth more than the original sum when the payments inevitably fell behind. Edmund Hartwell had been a proud man, and a stubborn one, and rather than ask his neighbors for help or tell his sons the truth about the situation, he had kept borrowing and kept promising until the debt had grown to a size that could not be ignored. When Jasper found out, not from his father but from Beaumont's foreman, who made a point of letting the information slip in front of witnesses at the grain merchants, he had confronted his father, and the conversation had gone badly. His father had said things in anger that a man should not say to his son, and Jasper, 22 and proud in the way young men are proud before life teaches them the cost of it, had said things back that he would spend years regretting. He had left that night. He had ridden west with $40, his horse, his saddle, and the intention of making enough money to pay his father's debt and come back with something to show for himself. He told no one where he was going except to leave a note on the kitchen table of his family's house. He did not go to Louisa to say goodbye, and that more than anything else was what had left a wound that 4 years had not managed to close. He had not gone to her because he had not known what to say. He had not known how to tell her that he was leaving when he could not tell her when he was coming back. He had not known how to ask her to wait for him when he was not sure he deserved to be waited for. And so he had done the thing that frightened men have always done, which is nothing, and he had ridden away in the dark, and he had carried the guilt of it the entire time he was gone. The years in between had not been easy, but they had been instructive. He had worked cattle drives north through Kansas, learning the rhythms of that brutal and beautiful work. The long hot days in the saddle, the river crossings where you held your breath, the night watches where the stars were so thick above the plains that they seemed like something you could touch. He had driven horses through Colorado, worked as a guard for a silver shipment through New Mexico territory, and spent 8 months in Abilene working at a livestock operation run by a fair-minded man named Hector Reyes, who had taught him more about patience and business than anyone else in his life. He had saved money the way a man saves money when he has a purpose, carefully, consistently, with very little spent on anything that was not necessary. He had written letters home, though not as many as he should have, and he had received letters back from his brother Thomas that told him his father had died in the winter of 1876, that his mother was managing, and that the debt to Beaumont had been renegotiated into something that was strangling the family slowly. He had written to Louisa once. It had taken him 3 weeks to finish the letter and another 2 days to actually send it. He had told her he was sorry for leaving the way he did, that he thought about Redemption Creek often, and that he hoped she was well. The letter was careful and restrained and said almost nothing of what he actually felt, because he had not trusted himself to say it plainly when he did not know what she felt in return. She had not written back, and he had told himself that this was an answer, and he had tried to believe it. He had been in Abilene in early June of 1878 when he made the decision. The cattle season had just ended, and Hector Reyes had made him an offer, a partnership in a new operation, moving into Colorado territory where the grass was good, and the prospects were better than they had been anywhere along the existing drives. It was the kind of offer a man like Jasper had been working toward. Real money, real land, real permanence. He had sat with it for 3 days, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath. On the 4th morning he had gotten up before dawn and known, with the kind of certainty that does not come from logic but from somewhere deeper, that he could not take it. Not because the offer was not good. It was excellent. but because accepting it meant planting himself in Colorado, and planting himself in Colorado meant admitting that Redemption Creek was behind him for good, and he had never been able to accept that. He told Hector honestly. He said there was a woman in Texas he had left without proper goodbye, and that he needed to go back and face what he had done and find out whether there was anything left to find. Hector, who had been married to the same woman for 23 years and who understood the particular weight of the unfinished thing, had shaken his hand and told him to ride safe. So Jasper had spent the last of June on the road south, covering the distance between Kansas and Texas on a good horse he had bought with money he had earned honestly, with enough left over in his saddlebag to pay off the remainder of his father's debt to Clifton Beaumont, which Thomas had written to him about in careful, precise numbers. He had made calculations in the evenings when he camped. He had enough. Not abundantly, not extravagantly, but enough. He had not written ahead to say he was coming. He had not been sure he would actually go through with it until he was already 3 days into Texas, and there was no reasonable direction left but forward. And now here he was, at the edge of the road leading up to the Townsend property, with the sun heavy and golden behind him, and Louisa standing at the gate as though she had simply stepped out to wait, which was, he would later find out, not entirely far from the truth. He swung down from the horse and tied the reins to the fence post, and he walked toward the gate with the particular kind of gait a man has when he is trying to look more composed than he feels. She did not come through the gate to meet him. She stayed on her side of it, her hand still resting on the post, watching him come with an expression that he could not yet fully read. He stopped a few feet from her with the gate between them, and he took off his hat. "Louisa," he said, and even to his own ears his voice sounded rough and not entirely steady. "Jasper Hartwell," she said, not as a greeting exactly, more like she was saying the name aloud to make sure it was real. "I know I owe you more of an explanation than I have any right to offer," he said. "I know I left without. You look like you have been on the road for some time," she said. He blinked. "About 3 weeks from Kansas." "Kansas," she repeated, as though she were filing this information away in a precise mental ledger. "I was working near Abilene." "I know," she said. "Thomas told my father." A year ago or so. He had not known that. He stood there absorbing it, the fact that some version of him, the working, traveling, distant version, had been a subject of conversation in this town while he was not here. "I should have written more," he said. "Yes," she said simply, without anger, which was somehow more cutting than anger would have been. He took a breath. He had rehearsed this. He had revised it on every mile of road from the Kansas border south, and now all of it had left him, and he was standing here with his hat in his hands like a man who had forgotten every word he knew. "I came back because I want to explain myself," he said, "and because he started again. I gave up a good offer, a partnership in Colorado. I turned it down and rode 3 weeks because I needed to see you and say what I should have said before I left." Her expression shifted then, just slightly. Something moved behind her eyes. "And what is that?" she asked, and her voice, for the first time, had lost just a fraction of its careful evenness. "That I am sorry," he said, "and that I have thought about you every single day since I rode out of this town. And that if you tell me to get back on that horse and ride away, I will do it. But I needed you to know." The wind moved through the grass. A horse somewhere on the property called out and went quiet. Louisa looked at him for a long, serious moment, the kind of moment that compresses itself in memory and expands to fill the space of years. Then she opened the gate. She did not say anything. She simply unlatched it and swung it open and stepped back, and the gesture was so plain and so complete in what it communicated that Jasper felt something in his chest give way like the last of a river dam after the spring flooding. He stepped through. She said, "You should come inside. You look like you could use water and something to eat." "That is the second most generous thing anyone has ever offered me," he said. "What was the first?" "That gate," he said, and something finally broke across her face. Not a smile, not yet, but something very near it. And she turned and walked toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and the gate swung gently shut behind them both. Louisa's mother, Agnes Townsend, was a small, precise woman in her mid-50s who had survived enough difficult seasons on the Texas frontier to view most situations with a kind of serene practicality. She was in the kitchen when Louisa brought Jasper inside, and she looked at him for exactly 2 seconds before she said, "Sit down, I will put on more water," which was not the reaction Jasper had been entirely prepared for but which he received with enormous gratitude. Her father, Warren Townsend, was out at the store until evening, which Jasper suspected was fortunate for everyone involved. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the water Agnes brought him and ate the bread and dried venison she set out without ceremony, and Louisa sat across from him, and they talked in the careful, probing way of two people who know each other very well but are testing whether the knowing has held through time and absence. She told him about the store, about the business of the last few years, about the expansion her father had done to the supply side, and the challenges they had faced when a competing merchant had come in from Austin with cheaper goods and more credit to offer. She told him about Della Price's millinery shop and the gossip and the small events that make up the texture of a life in a small town. She told him that his brother Thomas had married a woman named Catherine from over near Lampasas, and that they had a baby boy named Edmund, after their father. He told her about the cattle drives in Kansas and the long, monotonous, beautiful stretches of the plains. He told her about Hector Reyes and the partnership offer and why he had turned it down, and he watched her face carefully as he said that last part. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he had always loved about her. She gave conversation its full weight. Agnes Townsend excused herself to see to something in the other room, and in the sudden privacy Louisa folded her hands on the table and looked at him with her direct brown gaze and said, "Why did you not come to say goodbye?" He had known this was coming. "I was a coward," he said. "Not about leaving, about what I felt. I did not know how to tell you I was going when I could not tell you anything else, and so I said nothing, which was worse." "What is the anything else?" she asked. He met her eyes. "That I cared about you. That I had cared about you for years, and I did not know what to do with it when I was also 22 years old and angry at my father and determined to prove something I had not yet figured out how to name." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window the light was going orange and long as the afternoon pushed toward evening. "I received your letter," she said. "I was not sure you had. You wrote it like you were afraid of it." "I was," he admitted. "I did not write back," she said. "I thought about it for a long time. I started 3 times. What stopped you?" She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I did not know what I wanted to say. I was angry, but I was also—" She paused. "I was also not angry, and both of those things were difficult to put in a letter." He nodded slowly. "That is fairer than I deserved." "Yes," she said, "it was." He almost smiled at that. "I have not changed that much," he said. "I am still stubborn and I still talk less than I should, but I know what I came back for and I would like permission to try if there is any part of you that is willing to allow it." She considered this for a moment that seemed to stretch far beyond its actual duration. Then she said, "My father is going to want to speak with you," which was not a no. Warren Townsend came home at 6 in the evening and found Jasper Hartwell sitting at his kitchen table, looking somewhat recovered from the trail, but still wearing 4 years of absence like a garment he had not quite taken off. Warren was a large man with a gray beard and the deliberate economy of movement that belongs to men who have worked physical labor their whole lives. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at Jasper, and Jasper stood up. "Mr. Townsend," he said, "I know I am not necessarily a welcome sight in your house." "Sit back down," Warren said. He pulled out the chair across from Jasper and lowered himself into it. "I am going to ask you one question and I want an honest answer." "Yes, sir." "What are you here for?" The simplicity of the question was itself a kind of test. Jasper understood that. "I am here for your daughter," he said. "I came back to ask for the chance to court her properly if she is willing and if you will permit it. I have made something of myself these last 4 years. Not a great fortune, but enough to stand on. I am not here to cause grief or to make promises I cannot keep. I would like to do this the right way." Warren looked at him steadily. "You left her without a word." "I left a note for my family. I did not go to Louisa. That was wrong of me, and I know it." "It hurt her," Warren said, not accusing, just stating a fact plainly, the way that fathers sometimes do when they want you to understand exactly what is on the table. "I know," Jasper said. "I intend to spend whatever time she gives me making sure she knows that I understand what I did and that I will not repeat it." Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is her own woman. She makes her own decisions, as she always has." He paused. "But if you hurt her again, you will answer to me, and I am not a patient man on the subject of my daughter." "That is fair," Jasper said. Warren gave a single nod. "Agnes will set another plate," he said, and that was that. The first weeks of Jasper's return were careful and tentative in the way that all genuine things begin, not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent ones. He found a room at the boarding house on the eastern edge of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who charged a fair rate and asked very few questions. He went to see his brother Thomas within the first 3 days, and that reunion was its own complicated, layered thing. Thomas had inherited the house and the land and the weight of their father's decisions, and there was a conversation that needed to be had about all of it, and they had it, in the way of brothers who have not quite learned how to be gentle with each other, but who are trying. He also went to pay the remaining portion of his father's debt to Clifton Beaumont. Beaumont's ranch was the largest in the county, a sprawling operation on the flat land north of town, and Beaumont himself was a man in his late 50s with a carefully maintained appearance, and the kind of manner that sits right at the edge of cordiality without ever quite being warm. He received Jasper in his front parlor and listened to the proposal with a neutral expression. Jasper laid the money on the table, not everything he had, but the exact sum of the remaining debt, which Thomas had provided him in writing. "This clears it," he said. "I want a receipt, and I want your word that there are no other claims against my family's property." Beaumont looked at the money. "Your brother and I have come to an arrangement," he said. "I know," Jasper said. "I am renegotiating it in cash." There was a pause. Beaumont picked up the bills and counted them. He said, "You have been working hard." 4 years of it," Jasper said. Beaumont studied him for a moment, and something in that look told Jasper that the man had not entirely anticipated this and was calculating quickly. "All right," Beaumont said finally, and he handed a handwritten receipt to his foreman to have drafted properly. "The debt is cleared." Jasper took the receipt when it was prepared and folded it into his breast pocket and shook Beaumont's hand, which was the only thing that needed to happen between them, and he rode back to town feeling lighter than he had in a very long time. Thomas, when Jasper brought him the receipt, said nothing for a long moment, and then put his hand on Jasper's shoulder and pressed it once, firmly, and looked away, which was the most emotional Thomas had ever been in Jasper's memory. He began calling on Louisa properly, as he had told Warren he would. He came to the store on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when the business was slower, and he helped when there was inventory to be counted or boxes to be moved, and he talked to Warren and helped Agnes with the occasional task, making sure that his presence was useful and not merely decorative. But the time he wanted was with Louisa, and slowly, in the ways that time allows, she began to give it to him. They walked in the evenings when the heat had receded, along the road that ran east of town where the live oaks grew along the creek. She asked him questions, careful, intelligent questions, the kind she had always asked, and he answered them honestly, including the questions that were hard. She asked him if he had thought about staying away for good. He said yes. There had been a period of about 6 months when he had genuinely considered it, and she received that honestly without flinching. She told him that during that same period, she had gone to a dance in Millbrook with the banker's son she had eventually sent away, and that she had danced 3 dances, and then sat by the window for the rest of the evening thinking about something that had nothing to do with the dance, and that the banker's son had not understood why she was quiet on the drive home. Neither of them stated explicitly what that something was. They did not need to. Della Price, who had been Louisa's confidant since they were girls, came into the store one Wednesday afternoon and regarded Jasper with the kind of frank, assessing gaze that Louisa's best friend had every right to direct at him. She was a small, sharp woman of 25 with copper-colored hair and the frankest eyes Jasper had encountered outside of a poker game. "So you are back," Della said. "I am," he said. "She did not have an easy time of it," Della said, not unkindly but without any attempt to soften it either. "I know," he said. "You have 4 years of proving to do," she told him. "I am aware of that," he said. She studied him a moment longer and then said, "Good. Then we understand each other." And she turned to speak to Louisa about something entirely unrelated to him, and Jasper had the distinct impression that he had passed some kind of examination, though he could not have said precisely what the grade was. The summer moved around them in the particular way of Texas, summers hot and insistent, and full of thunderstorms that built up in the afternoon sky like something magnificent, and then broke over the land with everything they had. Jasper spent his days helping Thomas with the cattle, earning his keep that way while he figured out what came next, and his evenings were increasingly Louisa's in the way that evenings get claimed slowly, and then suddenly all at once. In August, there was a social at the church, the kind of gathering that small western towns arrange as often as they can because the alternatives are the saloon or solitude. And Jasper went as a matter of course, and Louisa was there in a blue dress that he had not seen before, and that made his ability to concentrate on any other aspect of the evening functionally useless. They sat together at supper, and afterward there was music, a fiddle player from out toward the hill country who was genuinely talented, and couples danced in the open space cleared for it. Jasper was not the most accomplished dancer in the room, but he was competent, and when he held out his hand to Louisa, she looked at it for a second and then placed hers in it, and they moved out onto the floor. Dancing is a particular kind of conversation that does not require words. It requires you to be present and attentive, and to respond to another person with the whole of your attention, and Jasper found that he was very good at this particular conversation. Louisa was a natural. She had always been graceful without being showy about it, and they fell into the rhythm of the music together in a way that felt so easy and so right that both of them were quiet about it afterward because there was nothing useful to say. He walked her home that night, and at the gate, the same gate where he had found her standing, where all of this had really begun, she turned to face him in the dark and said, "I am glad you came back." "So am I," he said, "more than I know how to say." She looked at him in the way she had, direct and unhurried. "I think you know how to say it," she said. "You are just careful about it." "Louisa," he started. "Good night, Jasper," she said. And there was something in the way she said it, warm, private, certain, that carried more in it than the words themselves. And she turned and went through the gate and up to the house, and he stood there in the dark with the sound of the crickets and the warm night air around him, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely in the right place. September came with the first cooling of the nights and the beginning of the cattle work that autumn brings in cattle country, and Jasper worked alongside Thomas during the days with a focus and a steadiness that his brother noticed and appreciated. The land was recovering from his father's debt and his father's years of stretched decisions, and there was real work to be done in building it back toward something solid. Jasper contributed his skills, and when the moment was right, some of the remaining money he had brought back from Kansas to reinvest in the operation. Thomas's wife, Catherine, was a quiet woman with a dry wit and a competence that matched Louisa's in a different register, and she and Jasper got on immediately. Little Edmund, who was barely a year old, was a solemn-faced baby with Thomas's dark eyes and a habit of staring at everything as though taking careful notes. Jasper, who had not spent much time around babies in his adult life, was surprised to find that he did not mind the child's company at all. One evening in late September, Jasper sat with Louisa on the porch of her family's home, while Warren and Agnes were inside, and the stars had come out in the full Texas density of them, and they had been talking for 2 hours already without running out of things to say. This was one of the markers Jasper had always used privately to distinguish the conversations that mattered when the time in them stopped behaving like time. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. She had her shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air. "All right," she said. "When I came back," he said. "When I rode up, you were at the gate." "I was," she said. "You looked like you knew I was coming," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then a small, careful smile moved across her face. "I had a feeling," she said. "That is not an explanation." "No," she agreed. "It is not." She paused. "Della's cousin works the mail exchange in Millbrook. He said a man had been asking after the road south through Texas about a month ago, coming from Kansas on a good roan horse." He blinked. "That could have been anyone. He mentioned the man had Hartwell eyes," she said. "Whatever those are. I suspect it means you look like your brother, and your brother is known around here." He laughed, which surprised them both. It was the full, genuine laugh, the one that had always come out unexpectedly. "And you decided to wait at the gate." "I decided not to be caught inside doing something undignified when you arrived," she said, and the prim exactness of the phrasing made him laugh again, and she was smiling properly now, the full version she did not distribute carelessly. "Louisa," he said, when the laughter had settled into something quieter. He turned toward her fully. "I have spent 4 years doing what I thought I needed to do, and I ended up exactly here, which is where I should have been from the beginning. I am not going to leave again. I am not asking you to trust that blindly. I know I have to earn it. But I want you to know that this is not something I am uncertain about. I am certain about you. I have been certain about you for years, and I was too foolish to act on it before, but I am not going to make that mistake twice." She looked at him steadily in the way that was wholly hers, that serious, full attention that made you feel like you had said something that was going to be considered properly rather than dismissed. Then she said, "I believe you." "Just like that," he said, not dismissing it but genuinely asking. "Just like that," she said. "I am a good judge of character, Jasper. I always have been, and I know you." He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the arm of the chair, and she let him. And they sat like that in the quiet of the September night with the stars very bright above them, and the sound of the house's small domestic life behind the door. And it felt like a beginning and also somehow like a return to a place that had always been waiting. He asked Warren for permission to formally court his daughter that same week, and Warren, who had been watching Jasper's conduct carefully for the 3 months since his return, gave it with a handshake and the terse directive that Jasper had better have plans that were concrete and not merely hopeful. Jasper did have plans. He and Thomas had been working through them in pieces, and they were becoming more solid by the day. The Hartwell land, freed of Beaumont's debt and properly managed, had potential not just for cattle, but for the grain operation that Thomas's wife Catherine had been quietly advocating for, a more reliable income stream than cattle prices alone. Jasper intended to build on the western portion of the property, enough land for his own house when the time came for one, and to work the operation with Thomas in a genuine partnership. It was not wealthy. It was not what Hector Reyes had offered him in Colorado. But it was real, and it was his, and it was here. And here was where Louisa was, and that made it more valuable than anything Colorado had to offer. In October, Louisa's father had a difficult stretch of health, nothing catastrophic, but enough to keep him home from the store for 2 weeks with a chest inflammation that Agnes monitored with anxious precision. Jasper helped where he could, coming to the store to assist with inventory and deliveries, so that Louisa did not have to manage it entirely alone. And Louisa was at the store every day, running things with the competence she had always had and the additional edge of worry underneath it. One evening after the store had closed and Warren was resting and Agnes was with him, Jasper found Louisa in the back room of the store going over the ledger by lamplight, and he could see in the set of her shoulders and the way she held her pen that she was tired in a way that went beyond the physical. He sat down at the table near her without being asked. She glanced up. He said, "What can I do?" She said, "I need to reconcile these supplier accounts and write 3 letters for new orders before the week's end." "I can write 2 of them," he said, "if you tell me what they need to say." She looked at him for a moment. "You are a better hand at letters than you gave the impression of," she said, and he understood that she was referring to the one letter he had sent in 4 years, and he received the gentle correction without deflection. "I am," he agreed. "I have been practicing." She gave him the letters to write. He wrote them at the table beside her while she worked on the ledger, and the lamplight was warm, and the store was quiet around them, and outside the occasional sound of the town at night passed by the window, and this working quietly beside each other with the specific weight of a shared task was one of the most intimate things he had ever experienced. When they finished, it was late enough that the streets were mostly quiet. He walked her home as he always did, and at the gate she stopped and turned to him and said, "Thank you," with a directness that had nothing formal in it. "Louisa," he said. "Yes." The words had been organizing themselves for weeks, but here in the dark with the gate between them and her face turned up toward him with that quality of full and unhurried attention, it was finally simple. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you told me to either help with the fence or stop staring, and I have loved you every day since, including every day I was not here, and I am going to love you every day going forward," and I wanted to say it plainly so there is no possible confusion on the subject. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for his heart to conduct a brief but intense negotiation with his composure. Then Louisa said, "I love you too, Jasper Hartwell. I have been waiting an unreasonable amount of time to say that to your face." He laughed. She laughed. And then he leaned across the gate and kissed her for the first time, a brief and careful and entirely certain thing, and she kissed him back with equal certainty. And when they drew apart, she was smiling in the full way, and so was he. And above them, the stars were doing what stars in Texas have always done, which is simply being magnificent without making any fuss about it. He asked her to marry him on a Friday morning in early November, and he did it in the store while Warren was present because he had decided that being straightforward was better than being theatrical, and that Warren deserved to witness it. He had no rings were not yet a common expectation in the Texas Hill Country in 1878, but he had thought carefully about what he was offering, and he laid it out plainly. The land on the western portion of his family's property, the house he intended to build on it, the partnership with Thomas and himself, which he offered with less confidence than any of the other items, but with the full weight of everything he had. Louisa, who had been behind the counter arranging a display of dry goods and had gone very still when he began speaking, looked at him for a moment when he finished. Warren, in the back of the store, had the particular quality of stillness that means a person is listening with considerable intensity. "Yes," Louisa said, not breathless, not performatively delighted, just clear and certain, the way she said everything that mattered to her. Warren came out from the back of the store and shook Jasper's hand and clapped him on the shoulder with a force that suggested several years of paternal anxiety being released at once. And Agnes, who had come in that morning to help with some rearranging and was therefore also present, wiped her eyes in a very matter-of-fact way and said she had known since September that this was coming, which was probably true. Della Price had to be told, and when she sat down in the chair behind her millinery counter and put her hands flat on the surface in front of her and said, "About time," with a conviction that suggested she had been waiting to say exactly that since approximately 1874. The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was cold but not brutal, and Jasper spent it in a productive flurry of building and planning. He hired 2 men from town, brothers named Isaac and Amos Garner, solid workers who knew timber and construction, and they began the foundation of the house on the western portion of the Hartwell land. He worked alongside them every day, learning the particulars of building in a way he had not needed to know before, and the house grew with the winter, taking shape against the hillside in the way that stone and timber do when put together by people who care about the outcome. Louisa came out to see it twice a week on average. She had opinions about the kitchen, which she communicated precisely, and which Jasper incorporated without argument because she was invariably right. She had opinions about the windows. She wanted them large, to let in the light, and about the arrangement of the rooms, and her practical intelligence shaped the emerging building into something that would be genuinely livable rather than merely standing. He watched her one afternoon standing in the skeleton of what would become the kitchen, her hands on her hips, her breath making small clouds in the cold air as she considered the layout, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything more completely right than this her, here, on this land, in this future that was assembling itself around them. They were married in March of 1879, in the church on Main Street, on a day that was warm and bright in the early way of Texas springs. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Neither of them wanted elaborate, but it was full. The whole of Redemption Creek seemed to come out for it, which is the prerogative of small communities with long memories, and there was music and food afterward in the churchyard, and Della stood up with Louisa, and Thomas stood up with Jasper, and little Edmund, who was now old enough to walk and extremely interested in everything, had to be retrieved from the vicinity of the punch bowl by Catherine twice. Warren danced with Louisa at the reception, a slow, dignified two-step that made Agnes press her handkerchief to her mouth for reasons unrelated to sadness. And then Jasper claimed her for the next one, and the one after that, and by the third dance people had stopped paying attention to anyone else on the floor, because there was something in the way the two of them moved together that was essentially private, not performed for an audience but wholly for each other, and watching it was like inadvertently witnessing something true. They moved into the house in April, when the last of the finishing work was done. It was not a grand house, 2 proper rooms and a kitchen on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, but it was built solidly from good materials, and it faced the morning sun the way Louisa had wanted. And on the first morning she stood in the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the hill country in the early light and said, "This is exactly right." And Jasper, leaning against the doorframe behind her, thought that this was the most concise and accurate description of his life he had ever heard. The spring of 1879 was good for the land. The rains came in the right amounts and at the right times, which in Texas is not something you take for granted, and the cattle on the Hartwell operation came through the winter well. Thomas had implemented Catherine's grain strategy in a modest but effective way, and the combination of the cattle income and the grain sales gave the family operation the kind of stability it had not had in years. Clifton Beaumont, whose debt against the Hartwell land had been fully extinguished, had turned his expansionist attention elsewhere, toward a smaller family to the north who were in the same situation that Edmund Hartwell had once been in. Jasper heard about it through Thomas and felt the particular discomfort of knowing the pattern and being unable to fully stop it. He went to the family, a couple named Hendricks with 3 children who were being quietly strangled by Beaumont's interest rates, and made them a different offer, a straightforward loan at no interest, repayable when they could manage it, in exchange for nothing except the understanding that they would not sell the land to Beaumont. The Hendricks family accepted. Jasper told Thomas, who disapproved of the financial generosity on practical grounds, but said nothing further because he recognized the decision for what it was. Beaumont, when the Hendricks family declined his expansion, and the reason eventually became common knowledge in the way that all things become common knowledge in small towns, was not pleased. He made his displeasure known in the indirect way of men of his particular type: cool greetings, pointed absence from certain social occasions, and Jasper bore it without any visible response, which was itself a kind of response. Louisa heard about the Hendricks loan from Agnes, who had heard from someone in the store. She waited until that evening to bring it up, and when she did it was not with criticism but with a very direct look and the question, "How much did you give them?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment, working through something internally, and then she said, "You should have told me before you did it." He acknowledged this. "You are right. We are married and it affects both of us, and I should have discussed it with you first." "Yes," she said, "you should have." She paused. "That said, it was the right thing to do. I am glad you did it." He looked at her. "You are. Beaumont has been doing this for 20 years, she said. "Someone should push back. I just want to be included in these decisions going forward." "You will be," he said. "Without exception." She nodded. "And then, practical as ever," she said, "I want to look at the ledger and see where we stand after this, and what we need to do differently in the next 6 months." And she got out the household book they kept together and they went through it at the kitchen table, side by side, which was how they made their decisions from then on together, in full view of each other, without secrets or unilateral choices. The summer of 1879 brought news that Louisa was expecting their first child, which she told Jasper on a warm July morning while he was still at the breakfast table, and which she delivered with the same composed directness she brought to everything, and which reduced him, unexpectedly, and to his own significant surprise, to a silence that lasted about 10 seconds before he pushed back from the table and came around to where she was standing and held her, carefully. The way you hold something that is already whole but that you suddenly understand is also fragile. "Are you well?" he asked, because this was the most important thing. "I am perfectly well," she said, which was true. She had always been healthy, and she was matter-of-fact about her pregnancy in a way that drove Agnes slightly to distraction, because Agnes had expected more emotional performance, and Louisa simply did not operate that way. The pregnancy was straightforward. Louisa kept working at the store through September, sensibly reducing her hours as autumn came, and she kept the household ledger and the household with the same steady competence. Jasper rode to town every day during these months because he wanted to be present, and because his awareness of how quickly things could change in the frontier conditions of 1879. With medical help limited to a doctor 2 towns over meant, he did not want to be far. Their son was born in January of 1880, in the house on the hill, with the help of a midwife named Mrs. Buford who had attended more births in this county than anyone else living. It was a long and difficult labor, and Jasper spent most of it in the kitchen doing the things you could do from there, keeping the fire, keeping water hot, stepping in when he was allowed to hold her hand and stepping out when he was told to. And when Mrs. Buford finally came to the kitchen door and told him he had a son, he went into the room and sat beside Louisa and looked at the wrapped bundle she held and felt something that he had no adequate language for. "He looks like he has opinions," Jasper said, studying the red, scrunched, furious-looking face. Louisa laughed, exhausted and radiant and entirely herself. "Then he is definitely yours," she said. "Is ours," Jasper said, and she looked at him with the kind of smile that has nothing performed in it at all. They named the boy William Edmund Hartwell, William for no particular reason except that it felt right, and Edmund after Jasper's father, which was a piece of complicated family business that Jasper handled by simply making the decision and standing behind it. Thomas, when he heard, was silent for a moment and then said "good," in a way that contained considerably more than the word. Will Hartwell was a healthy child with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and an apparently infinite capacity for observation that began to display itself almost immediately. He was quiet in the way that some babies are quiet, not passive, but watching, taking notes, as his mother had once said about Thomas's baby Edmund, who was now a toddler with extremely strong feelings about horses. The year 1880 was a full one. The Hartwell operation continued to develop, and Jasper took on a third worker, a young man named Pete Holloway who was 18 and green and earnest, and who reminded Jasper with a pang he did not entirely expect of himself at that age. He taught Pete the work carefully and honestly, the way Hector Reyes had taught him, because that was the best thing you could do with a young man who was willing to learn. Redemption Creek itself was growing, as all Texas towns were growing in this period, with new families arriving from the east and the south, some of them with money and some of them with nothing but the willingness to work, all of them chasing the particular promise that the western frontier had been selling for decades. With growth came complication questions about land, about water rights, about who had been there first and who had legal claim to what, and the kind of low-grade tensions that gather in growing places before they either resolve or break open. Beaumont remained a presence in the county, his operations large and his methods unchanged, and Jasper remained a quiet counterweight to that presence in the small, consistent ways available to him, making sure the families he knew had access to fair terms when they needed them, speaking plainly at the county meetings about the water rights questions, supporting the new schoolteacher who arrived in the fall of 1880 and who wanted to establish a real school in place of the sporadic lessons the church had been providing. Louisa was involved in all of it. She had always had a clear sense of the community's texture, the way the people in it related to each other and where the pressures were, and she brought this to the conversations they had in the evenings after Will was asleep and the house was quiet. She had a gift for seeing what was underneath a situation, and Jasper had learned, was still learning, to listen for it. "You know what Beaumont is actually worried about," she said one evening in the fall of 1880, while they sat on the porch in the cooling air. "The water rights," he said. "No," she said, "the water rights are just the mechanism. What he is actually worried about is that people in this county are starting to organize in ways that do not include him, the Hendricks family, the new school, the fact that you have been at 3 county meetings in a row and people listen to you." He was quiet for a moment. "You think he will do something?" "I think men like him always do something when they feel something slipping," she said. "I'm not sure what shape it will take, but I think we should be paying attention." She was right, as she generally was about these things. What Beaumont did was quiet and legal and quite effective in the short term. He bought the rights to a significant portion of the creek water that ran through the western part of the county, having hired a lawyer from Austin to construct the purchase in terms that were technically sound, even if their ethics were questionable. And he used the leverage of water access to pressure several of the smaller families into arrangements on his terms. The community meeting that followed this development was the most contentious public event in Redemption Creek since a dispute over the road expansion 3 years earlier. Jasper spoke at it, not with heat, which was not his way, but with clarity, laying out the factual situation and the legal options as he understood them, having spent 2 evenings prior consulting with Louisa and with the county's only practicing attorney, a man named Charles Webb who was old and slow but precise. The outcome was not everything Jasper had hoped for, but it was something. A formal agreement reached between the water rights holders in the county that guaranteed minimum access to the creek for all established farms and homesteads, regardless of upstream purchases. Beaumont's attorney objected. The county judge, who had known most of the families in the room since before any of this started, ruled in a way that suggested he was tired of the entire situation and wished everyone would behave more reasonably. It was not a dramatic victory, but it held, and the families who had been most exposed relaxed visibly, and afterward in the churchyard several of them shook Jasper's hand and a few of the older ones, men who had been in this country since before the Hartwell family arrived, said things to him about his father that were generous and complicated, and that he received with the respect they deserved. Louisa was standing beside him when one of the older ranchers, a man named Santos Garcia who had worked this land longer than most, said quietly, "Your father was a good man who made difficult choices. It is good to see his son making different ones." He felt her hand find his, brief and certain, and he held it while he said everything that needed to be said to Santos Garcia, And then they walked home together in the early winter evening with Will asleep against Jasper's shoulder, and the sky above the hill country was the deep blue of a cold sunset, and the town was quiet behind them, and the house up on the hill had its window lit warm from the fire Agnes had laid for them earlier in the day. The years moved through them in the particular way that good years move, not slowly, not fast exactly, but with a quality of fullness that means each one is distinct in memory. Will learn to walk and then to run, and he had a solemnity that cracked into sudden pure delight in the way that certain children do, unexpectedly, like sunlight through clouds. He was devoted to the horses in the way of children who grow up around them, and Jasper spent hours with him in the barn, teaching him the same things his own father had taught him in the years before everything had gotten complicated. In the spring of 1882, Louisa told him she was expecting again, and this time she told him in bed on a Sunday morning, with the early light coming through the large windows she had insisted on. And he held her and they were quiet together for a moment in the way of people who have already weathered enough together to know that this is good news and nothing to be afraid of. This birth was easier than the first, still hard, because births in 1882 in the Texas Hill Country were not easy by any modern standard, but shorter and managed well by Mrs. Buford, who arrived with the same calm efficiency, and who delivered the second Hartwell child before noon on a bright October morning. A girl this time, dark-haired and bright-eyed, with Louisa's cheekbones clearly visible even in the first hours, which made Louisa smile in a way she did not try to contain. They named her Alice May Hartwell, and Will, who was 2.5 and had been told extensively about the coming baby but had not entirely believed in it until this moment, stood in the doorway of his parents' room and looked at the bundle in his mother's arms with an expression of such serious, wondering consideration that even the midwife laughed. "Baby," he said. "Your sister," Louisa told him. Will considered this for a long moment. Then he came into the room and climbed carefully onto the bed beside his mother, which he had been told he was allowed to do gently, and he looked at Alice with enormous solemn attention and said, "Hello," in the tone of someone making a formal introduction, and Alice looked back at him with the vague and unfocused gaze of the newborn, and it was the beginning of something that would be a constant of both their lives. Della Price, who came to see the baby 3 days later, held Alice with the particular careful tenderness of women who love children and said, "She is perfect, Louisa," with a sincerity that made Louisa reach over and squeeze her hand. Della herself had married the previous year, a man named Robert Price from the eastern part of the county, a quiet and good-humored carpenter who had been brought to Redemption Creek by a church-building project and had stayed, initially because the project extended and eventually because Della was there. Their wedding had been the event of the social season in 1881, done in Della's particular style, which meant that every detail was precisely chosen, and the overall effect was genuinely beautiful. And Jasper had stood beside Louisa at it and watched Della take Robert's hand at the altar, and thought about his own wedding 3 years earlier with the particular warmth of memory. Della and Louisa remained the constants in each other's lives through these years, through the deaths and the births, and the various community dramas, and the daily texture of life, in a place that was still figuring out what it was going to be. Jasper liked Robert Price enormously, and was glad of his company, and the four of them fell into the particular ease of two couples who find each other's company genuinely preferable to most alternatives. The Hartwell operation continued to grow steadily, not explosively but with the kind of solidity that lasts. Pete Holloway had become genuinely skilled and had taken on more responsibility as the years passed, and Jasper had given him a small stake in the operation in 1882 as acknowledgement of this, a decision that Pete received with a quiet dignity that reminded Jasper again of the young man's potential. Isaac and Amos Garner had finished the house and moved on to other work in the county, and the land had 2 additional part-time workers during the busy seasons. Thomas and Catherine had added a daughter to their family in 1881, named Maria, and little Edmund Hartwell the younger had grown into a boy of considerable personality, who had a particular gift for finding trouble that was creative rather than malicious. The two families, Jasper's and Thomas's, were close in the way of families who live on the same land and work toward the same ends, with the occasional disagreement handled in the Hartwell way, which was to say it was discussed plainly, sometimes heatedly, and then resolved and not held over anyone's head. Clifton Beaumont's health began to decline in 1883, which was information that moved through the county in the way that information about powerful men moves carefully, with speculation attached. His son, a man named Gerald Beaumont who had been educated in the East and who returned to take over the management of the ranch operation, was different from his father in ways that were immediately apparent. Gerald was not warm exactly, but he was fair, and within his first year of operation he had renegotiated several of the more extractive arrangements his father had established with the smaller families in the county into something that resembled actual business rather than slow-moving predation. Jasper dealt with Gerald Beaumont at the county level and found him a man he could work with, which was not something he had expected but which he received as good news. The tensions of the Beaumont question, which had been a background note in the county's life for so long, began slowly to ease. Warren Townsend's health remained a periodic concern. He had the chest trouble again in the winter of 1883, worse this time, and Agnes managed it with characteristic thoroughness, but with a worry underneath that Louisa saw and shared. Jasper drove to Millbrook for the doctor on the worst night, 2 hours each way in the dark on winter roads, and came back with a young physician named Dr. Callahan who had set up a new practice there, and who, unlike the older doctor he had replaced, was knowledgeable and direct about both the diagnosis and the treatment. Warren recovered. But the recovery was slower than before, and it prompted a family conversation about the store and the future of it. And it was Louisa who navigated this with her particular combination of practicality and care, arranging things so that Warren's load was reduced without making him feel reduced, which required considerable delicacy, and which she managed exactly right. In the spring of 1884, Jasper and Louisa sat on their porch in the evening, the same porch they had sat on in the early days of their marriage, on the same chairs that were now worn comfortable with use, and the hill country was green from the spring rains, and Will, who was 4, was running in the yard with a stick and important business to attend to, and Alice, who was 18 months and recently and triumphantly walking, was navigating the porch steps with great concentration. "I want to tell you something," Louisa said. He looked at her. She was watching the children with that warm, steady attention, but her hands were folded in her lap in the particular way they did when she was preparing to say something she had been organizing for some time. "All right," he said. "I have been thinking about the store," she said. "My father is not going to be able to continue managing it the way he has been, not without real cost to his health." "I know," he said. "I want to take it over," she said. "Not just help, take it over. Manage it properly. Expand the supplier network the way I have been thinking about for 2 years, and make it into something that can support my parents without them having to worry about the daily work of it." He looked at her. "You have given this a great deal of thought." "I have," she said. "I know it is a significant commitment of time. I know it means adjustments to how things run here." She paused. "I am not asking permission. I am telling you what I want to do because we discuss things." "We do," he said, "and I wanted to know if you have concerns that I have not thought of." He was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking it through. The store, the time it would take, the children who would need arrangement during the hours she was there, the fact that she would be excellent at it, the fact that she had probably already thought through every practical concern he might raise. "I think you should do it," he said. "I think it is exactly the right thing, and I think your father will be relieved even if he does not quite say so, and I think you will make it better than it has ever been." She looked at him for a moment. "I was prepared for this to be more complicated," she said. "I know," he said, "but it is not. You want to do something important and practical and good, and you are going to be extraordinary at it." He paused. "What do you need from me?" She exhaled, and something in her settled. "I need us to talk about the children's schedule," she said. "And I need you to not tell my father about the plan yet, because I want to talk to him myself." "Of course," he said. She nodded. Then she looked out at the yard where Will was conducting his important business with his stick, and Alice had successfully navigated the last step and was now sitting in the grass with an expression of profound satisfaction at her achievement. Louisa's expression did something complicated and warm and completely unguarded. The face she wore when she thought no one was looking at her, which Jasper had been watching for 5 years, and which he expected to spend the rest of his life watching. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had that evening on the porch so many years before when everything between them was still beginning, and she turned her hand and held his back, and they sat there in the spring evening with their children in the yard and the hill country green around them, and the long light of the afternoon moving gold across everything. She spoke to Warren about the store the following week. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and Jasper was not present for it because Louisa had been clear that this was between her and her father. But he saw the shape of the outcome in the way Warren looked at him at supper that evening. Not defeated, not reluctant, but with something that was very close to relief, the kind that comes when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and someone you trust finally takes hold of the other end. Agnes said after Warren had excused himself that evening, "She has wanted this for years, you know." "I know," Jasper said. "He has known too," Agnes said, with the particular quiet authority of women who know everything about the people they love. He just needed to hear her ask for it. Louisa took over the formal management of the Townsend General Store in June of 1884, and within 3 months it was already apparent that she had been right about all of it. She renegotiated the supplier agreements from Austin and San Antonio in terms that improved the store's margins by a significant amount. She expanded the goods available, particularly in the areas of household supply, where there had always been gaps that residents of Redemption Creek had been going to Millbrook to fill. She hired a young woman from town, Clara Mason, to assist at the counter, and she trained her with the same direct patience she brought to everything. Warren came in 3 mornings a week, more for the sake of having somewhere to go than because the store needed him, and Louisa arranged things so that he was genuinely useful in the ways he could manage, keeping the account books in a secondary capacity, speaking to the older customers who had known him for decades, while the daily operation ran on her rhythms. The store was good. It was genuinely, measurably, commercially good, and within the year it was the best-performing retail operation in the county, and people from Millbrook were making the trip to Redemption Creek rather than the reverse, which was a reversal that the town noticed with considerable satisfaction. Jasper watched all of this with a pride that had nothing possessive in it, the kind that comes from watching someone you love be exactly who they are in the full expression of their capability. He told her so. She received the telling with characteristic directness. "I know," she said, and the simplicity of it contained more warmth than any elaboration could have. And then she showed him the updated ledger for the 3rd quarter of 1884 because she knew he would want to see the numbers. He did want to see them. They were excellent. The children grew in the particular compound way of children, in a house where they are loved and attended to, without being managed too tightly, with their own interests and personalities taking shape alongside each other. Will was 7 in 1885, serious and imaginative by turns, already clearly going to be tall, with a specific gift for anything to do with horses that was becoming more apparent every month. He had begun helping in the barn in real ways, not just following Jasper around but doing actual work, and he absorbed instruction with the kind of focused attention that made teaching him satisfying. Alice at 3 was everything her cheekbones had promised, with Louisa's directness already fully formed in miniature, and a relationship with her brother that was the warm, complicated, negotiated thing that sibling relationships always are. She had decided by this point that she had opinions about everything, which was regarded by Jasper with complete delight, and by Louisa with the particular expression of a woman recognizing something very familiar about herself. Pete Holloway, at this point 25 and thoroughly established in the Hartwell operation, had by 1885 begun courting a woman named Josephine Avery, a quiet and careful woman who taught at the school that had finally, after 4 years of fundraising and community effort, become a proper building with a proper teacher. Jasper was deeply pleased about this, both because Pete deserved happiness and because Josephine Avery was clearly excellent, and he told Pete so in the direct, economical way he had learned worked best with Pete, which was to say it once and mean it and not repeat it. Della and Robert Price had their first child in 1884, a boy named Henry, and the companionable connection between the two families deepened further with the addition of this generation, the children playing together with the unconscious ease of young humans who have not yet learned to be complicated about friendship. The community of Redemption Creek in these years was finding its shape. The school, the expanded church. A small newspaper that started up in 1883 and was run by a man named Thornton who had opinions about everything and the printing press to express them. The water rights agreement that Jasper had helped negotiate continued to hold, maintained against periodic pressure by the collective will of the families it protected. Gerald Beaumont, in a development that surprised many people including Jasper himself, became a reasonably constructive presence in the county in the years following his father's death. He was not beloved. He was too reserved for that, and the history of his family's practices was not forgotten. But he was honest in his dealings, and he did not attempt to revive his father's methods. And in a county with a complicated relationship with large land ownership, this represented a meaningful improvement. Clifton Beaumont died in the winter of 1884, and Jasper went to the funeral because going was the right thing, and he stood in the December cold and thought about his father, who had been a good man undone by pride and by one powerful neighbor's particular appetite, and he thought about the fact that Edmund Hartwell's debt had been paid and the land was free and the family was whole, and he thought the thought he always thought at funerals, which is that time is short, and the things you do with it are what remain. In the spring of 1886, Louisa was expecting their third child. She told him on a March morning with the new green of the hills coming in the window, matter of fact as always, and also with the particular warm brightness she had, when something truly delighted her underneath the practicality. He held her and they were quiet together as they always were on these mornings, which had become one of the great private constants of their life together. Those still mornings before the children were up, with the hill country outside and the house quiet around them. 3 children, he said. You sound surprised, she said against his shoulder. I am not surprised, he said. I am grateful. Good answer, she said. He laughed. Their third child was born in October of 1886, the easiest birth of the 3, which was the ordinary miracle that sometimes happens, and which everyone around them received with the relief of people who have learned not to take such things for granted. A boy, this time dark-haired like his sister, but with his father's chin already apparent in the first hours, which Louisa noted, and Jasper was transparently pleased about. They named him Daniel George Hartwell Daniel for the plainness of it, which they both liked, and George after Robert Price, because Robert had been the one to ride hard for Dr. Callahan when the labor started in the night, and because this was the kind of thing you acknowledge when you name a child. Robert, when he was told, said nothing for a moment and then said, "That is a fine name," in a voice that was somewhat lower than usual, which from Robert was the equivalent of a speech, and Della, beside him, pressed his arm with the particular completeness of a woman who knows exactly how her husband feels about something. The years after Daniel's birth were years of settling, Not the settling of things gone wrong, but the settling of things gone right. The particular deep establishment of a life that has found its right form and is living inside it. The children grew. Will, at 9 and 10 and 11, was becoming the person he was going to be: responsible, devoted to the horses, funny in the dry, understated way that had clearly come from Jasper, with a kindness underneath everything that had clearly come from both of them. Alice remained herself, which was entirely sufficient, opinionated and warm, and already reading everything she could get her hands on from the school's growing library. Daniel, at 1 and 2, was as sunny and uncomplex as a spring morning, a baby who slept when he was supposed to and was happy most of the time, and seemed genuinely interested in the world around him. Louisa ran the store and ran the household and ran her share of the family decisions with the same consistent, excellent judgment she had always had, and she and Jasper had developed over the years of their marriage the particular fluency of two people who know each other deeply and who have learned how to disagree well, to say the thing directly, to hear it directly, to find the ground between them without performance or resentment. They disagreed about money sometimes. They disagreed occasionally about the children. He was inclined toward more latitude in certain things, and she was inclined toward more structure, and these disagreements were real, not just surface friction, and they had them fully and resolved them genuinely. He had never once left the house in anger without coming back. She had never once held a resolved thing over him again. These were not small achievements in the life of a marriage. Jasper sat on the porch one evening in the summer of 1888, when the light was doing the thing it did in July in the Texas hill country, going amber and long across the hills, and he watched Louisa walk across the yard toward him from the gate, coming back from the store, her hat in one hand and her hair starting to come loose from its pins in the way it always did by the end of the day. She was 31 years old, and she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with the life that was living itself through her, in the way she held herself, in the expression her face had when she wasn't performing anything, in the particular sureness of her movement across the ground that was hers. She saw him watching from the porch and did not alter her pace or her expression. She came through the yard gate and up the porch steps and sat down in the chair beside him with the ease of 10 years of evenings on this porch, and she said, "Will is in the barn with the bay mare. She is restless." "I know," he said. "I checked on her at noon. She should foal in the next day or two." "He is very concerned about it," Louisa said, and there was amusement in her voice. "He is 9, Jasper said. "He should be very concerned. It means he cares about the right things." Louisa looked at him. "You are pleased about that?" "Enormously," he said. She settled back in her chair, and the evening moved around them in the way evenings do when you are fully present in them. Somewhere in the house, Daniel woke up from his nap and began making the sounds that preceded actual demands, and they heard Alice's footsteps cross the floor above them and her voice, already taking charge of the situation, which was entirely on brand. "I have been thinking," Louisa said after a while. "I know," he said. She glanced at him. "You cannot know. I have not told you yet. You have the face you have when you have been thinking about something for 2 weeks and have reached a conclusion," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You are getting very good at that," she said. "I have been studying you for 17 years, he said. She looked at him fully then, and the expression she had was the one that still, after all of it, undid him somewhat, the warm, unguarded, certain thing that she only did when they were alone or nearly alone. "I have been thinking," she said, "that we might expand the store's premises. Clara is capable of managing more than we give her, and there is the space next door that Thornton has been trying to sell since he moved the newspaper office. I have run the numbers." "Of course you have," he said. "It makes sense to do it," she said. "Do you want to see the ledger tomorrow?" he said. "Tonight I would like to sit here with you." She considered this and then settled back again, turning her face slightly toward the last of the light. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." They sat there as the evening came fully in, the two of them on the porch of the house he had built and she had made into something, with the hill country spread around them in the dusk, and the children's voices inside behind them, and the horses quiet in the barn, and the long settled rightness of everything they had made. He thought about the morning he had ridden back into Redemption Creek, worn and uncertain, and carrying a decision across 1,000 miles. He thought about her at the gate in the amber afternoon light, with her hand on the post and her chin lifted, waiting with that steady, certain quality, as if she had known exactly what was coming and had simply stepped out to meet it. He had given up a good offer, a real one, a solid future in Colorado with money and land and a clear road forward. He had turned it down and ridden 3 weeks south on a road he was not certain would lead anywhere except rejection, because the alternative, accepting the future that did not include her, was simply not something he could manage when it came down to it. And she had opened the gate. This was what he had. This house, this land, these children, this woman. This evening, this porch, this particular quality of light on the hill country, the debt paid, the family rebuilt, the things worth having, arrived at by the long way around, which was the only way he had ever been capable of arriving at anything. He reached over for her hand as he had done in the beginning and did now without thinking, and she gave it as she always did, simply, without ceremony, entirely. "Jasper," she said after a while. "Yes." "I am glad you came back," she said. "So am I," he said, "every day." She squeezed his hand once, and they were quiet together in the way of people who do not need to fill the silence, who have made enough of a life together that the silence itself is full. The bay mare in the barn foaled before dawn the next morning, a colt, healthy and steady on his legs within the hour, which Will discovered when he crept out at first light and came back into the house at a run to tell everyone. Daniel, who was being carried down the stairs by his mother in the gray early morning, was fascinated by this news in the way of very small children who find everything equally wonderful. Alice wanted to name the colt immediately and had suggestions. Will said he was the one who found him and he should name him, and Louisa said they would discuss it as a family after breakfast, with the particular tone that ended negotiations. At breakfast, with the morning coming in through the large windows and the coffee hot and Daniel making demands about his porridge and Alice presenting her case for the colt's name with the legal thoroughness of someone who had clearly been planning this speech, Jasper looked across the table at Louisa, who was listening to her daughter's argument with a straight face that was costing her some effort. She caught his eye and something passed between them, the small, private language of 10 years of mornings, entirely their own. He had ridden 3 weeks for this. He had given up Colorado and the partnership and the clear and certain road for this kitchen, this table, these children, this woman. Every single day, it was the best decision he had ever made. The store expanded the following spring, just as Louisa had planned, and Clara Mason was given a proper wage increase to reflect her new responsibilities, and the Townsend General Store became the largest and best-supplied commercial establishment between Redemption Creek and Millbrook, which was a source of significant pride in the town and a source of precise, unshowy satisfaction in Louisa, who did not believe in making too much of herself but who knew the difference between what she had built and what had been there before she built it. Warren Townsend lived to see it, which mattered. His health remained managed rather than robust, but he was present, coming to the store on his 3 mornings, visiting with old customers, watching his daughter work with the expression of a man who has come to understand certain things about himself and the people he loves, too late to be comfortable but not too late to be grateful. He sat with Jasper sometimes in the evenings when they visited, and they had the conversations that fathers-in-law and sons-in-law have when they have moved past the formal distance and into something that resembles actual regard, and Jasper found himself grateful for it in a way he had not anticipated. Thomas and Catherine's family continued in their steady, productive way on the eastern portion of the Hartwell land, and the 2 brothers had achieved in adulthood the ease they had not entirely had in youth. The disagreements still happened but were shorter and more quickly resolved, and the collaboration between the operations was genuine and mutually beneficial. Young Edmund, Thomas's boy, was coming on 12 by 1888 and was showing an aptitude for the grain side of the operation that delighted Catherine and bemused Thomas, who had always been more comfortable with cattle. Maria, their daughter, and Alice Hartwell had formed the kind of friendship that happens between girls close in age who live near each other, that particular intensity of childhood female friendship that is its own ecosystem. Pete Holloway married Josephine Avery in 1886, a small and happy wedding in the same church where Jasper and Louisa had married, and Jasper stood up with Pete and thought about his own wedding and the weight of that day, and how strange and right it had felt. Josephine continued teaching at the school, and Pete ran his share of the Hartwell operation with the steady competence of someone who has grown into his work over years, and they were building a life with the same deliberate patience that Jasper recognized from his own. By 1889, Will Hartwell was 11 years old and could handle most of the horses on the property with a skill that made even the older men who worked there take note, and Jasper had begun to think seriously about the boy's future, not with the pressure of expectation, but with the particular alertness of a parent who is watching what a child is becoming and wants to make sure the road ahead is clear. There would be land when the time came. There would be a place here for Will if he wanted it, and a place in the world outside if he wanted that instead, and Jasper's intention was to make sure his son knew both were possible. Alice, at 7, had her nose in every book the school library possessed and was beginning to press her parents for more, and Louisa had been ordering books from a supplier in San Antonio through the store, which meant that the Hartwell house had a growing collection of reading material that became something of a neighborhood resource. This had been entirely unplanned and was entirely in character. Daniel, at 2 going on 3, was beginning to develop the personality that would be his: easy, social, interested in people in the direct and uncomplicated way of certain children who simply like humans and find them consistently interesting. He followed his older siblings around with devoted attention and was followed in turn by the family's dog, a rangy brown animal named Biscuit who had arrived as a stray in 1887 and had never left, which was everyone's preference. Jasper sat at the kitchen table one Saturday afternoon in the fall of 1889, with the household ledger open in front of him and a cup of coffee at his elbow, and Louisa was across the table with the store ledger, and the children were variously occupied outside and upstairs, and the house was full of the particular alive quiet of a Saturday afternoon when nothing is wrong and everything is present. He looked up from the ledger. Louisa was writing something in the store's accounts, her pen moving precisely across the page, a slight line of concentration between her brows, her hair, still dark, with just the beginning of gray at her temples that he found beautiful in a way he had tried and failed to adequately express, caught up in its pins in the way that would be coming loose by evening. This was his life. This was the thing he had come back for. The thing he had ridden 3 weeks south through Texas to find, the thing that had been standing at the gate in the amber afternoon waiting for him with a hand on the post and a steady, certain look that had told him more than any words could. He had given up Colorado. He would give it up again every day. "You are looking at me," she said without looking up from the ledger. "I am," he said. "Is there something you need?" "No," he said. "I am just—" He stopped, tried again. "I am just glad." She looked up then. The pen rested in her hand. She looked at him with that full, direct, warm attention that was entirely hers and had always been entirely his. "So am I," she said. And she went back to the ledger, and so did he, and the afternoon moved around them in the full, golden, particular way of afternoons in October in the Texas hill country, and Biscuit scratched at the back door to be let in, and Alice called something from upstairs, and outside Will's voice and Daniel's voice came from the direction of the barn, and the world was right. Not perfect. It had never been perfect and would not be, because nothing worth having ever is. But right. Deeply, genuinely, permanently right. The way things are right when you have arrived at them by the honest path and built them with the full weight of what you are. The gate had been opened. He had stepped through. And everything, from that first amber afternoon to this October Saturday with the ledgers and the coffee and the children's voices, and the woman across the table with her pen moving precisely across the page, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be.